Involve vigorously prosecuting traffickers, particularly those selling children for sex, targeting the purchasers, as well as changing perceptions about those trafficked, treating them not as criminals, but as victims. DA O'Malley is well known for other groundbreaking model responses in the following areas: identity theft, real estate fraud, truancy, environmental protection, and sexual assault and domestic violence. Her innovative ideas have led to numerous awards, and Alameda County's DA office serves as a model for other offices around the country. We're also honored to have Joni Leventis with us this evening. He attended the University of Utah and also graduated from Hastings College of Law. He joined the Alameda County District Attorney's Office in 1994 after being in private practice for 3 years. He has tried multiple homicide and sexual assault cases. In 2011, she was named Outstanding Prosecutor of the Year by the California District Attorneys Association. The following year, she was promoted to Assistant District Attorney and is currently head of the Sexual Assault Prosecution Team. And with her this evening is Phoebe. Hi, Phoebe. Phoebe is training to be a therapy dog, working with victims as they make their way through the criminal justice system. Please join me in welcoming DA O'Malley and Assistant DA Joni and Phoebe to Albany.
So good evening. Really happy to be here. And I'll just give a little bit more background, which is what brings me to so happy to have this conversation. We've been doing it all over our county and being part of the discussion in California as well. When I was in college, I became a rape crisis advocate, a volunteer. Baywar was the first one in America, and they're still going strong. They're actually located at our Family Justice Center. I was in one of the second or third rape crisis centers, and what I saw at that time was were a lot of victims that were coming forward about being sexually assaulted, but a system that did everything to push them away. People didn't understand any of the sexual offenses. They didn't understand the impact of sexual assault or sexual harassment. And so it's really been a mission of mine since I joined the office, and actually since that experience, to change that paradigm. And I'm happy to tell you that Alameda County has led the way in many respects around how we have responded to crimes like sexual assault. We were one of the first counties in the country to have a sexual assault response team that is able to deal with those who have been sexually assaulted, and they go to the hospital for a forensic sexual assault exam. And the examiner is someone who is trained, specially trained, to do a forensic exam in the most humane and kind and supportive way. And then we have a whole team around that. Of course, the police are part of that team. We also we led the country in bringing awareness to untested forensic sexual assault kits, or what sometimes they call rape kits. I was sharing with the mayor that my efforts in this started several years back for Alameda County, but by chance I had the opportunity to meet the FBI director, the former FBI director, Comey, and there was a moment in his conversation with people, a large group, and I said, I have something to talk about, and that's we have too many untested rape kits. And what we determined across America was there could be as many as 500,000 kids that never got tested. So I had the chance to draw a diagram for some people, and that led to a conversation, and that led to funding from Congress. And just last week we learned that the Congress has re-upped the funding, so now we're at $180 million of bipartisan new money that's come out of the Congress. And so far across this country, they've tested almost 350,000 kits through the money that we help to advocate for. But tonight we're going to talk, Joni and I are going to talk about the issues that are really current today. And that is a lot having to do with sexual harassment and on the spectrum all the way to sexual assault. We're anxious and we're happy to be in the high schools talking to younger people about these issues. We're in the workplace. And I participated in a program a couple of weeks ago in downtown Oakland, where there were a couple of women who also spoke, 4 of us, who had actually had the experience of sexual harassment where it became very detrimental to their careers. And so it was a really wonderful conversation. People in the audience were able to speak up about their own situation. And it was really quite enlightening to hear that we still have this issue that's going on. So I'm going to talk about the sexual harassment part of this presentation. Joni, who is the head of our sexual assault unit, is going to go into the law, because we do feel that it's important for those that have been personally impacted, or they know someone who's been impacted by this issue, to understand the difference and the spectrum of bad language, harassing language, sexual harassment, all the way to sexual assault. So we all know about the Me Too initiative. It actually started many years ago by a woman, Tarana Burke, back in 2006. But it was revived more recently, as we all know, by Alyssa Milano, who went on Twitter to talk about her own friend. Her friend, Rose McGowan, had actually filed a complaint with the New York City Police Department against Harvey Weinstein. And the DA's office at that time declined to prosecute because they just didn't see what Ms. McGowan was saying. And when Alyssa Milano put out the Me Too hashtag, and this is the tweet that she actually posted, suggested by a friend, if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And in fact, it has really set off a hailstorm in terms of people speaking up. My own feeling is that what my response and reaction to it was, I hope it's not the first time for some of the people that did post Me Too, that they felt that they could really talk about their own experience. So of course there's the Me Too, hashtag Me Too, and now we've got the hashtag Time's Up, which is a little variation on Me Too. The hashtag Time's Up, we'll just reference very quickly, is really about it's time for people to take responsibility. It's time for us to stop putting up with the type of behavior that we're hearing about. But we don't want to focus on just the big stars and the big names, because what we do know is that this type of behavior happens every day in all of our communities. So the moment has really become something much larger than Alyssa Milano posting or inviting people to post Me Too. What it's done is it's created this lens that we're able to look more globally, and we have that sense of, there is a sense of taking blinders off. For many of us that have been involved in this issue, taking the blinders off happened many years ago. And I know that for some, I can remember back when I was in college, what with the Me Too discussion points that women were coming forward. And in those days, there were very few men, but some men did come forward about their own victimization, about either from sexual harassment or sexual language or sexual assault. But it was primarily women who were speaking up. And as I shared with you in the beginning, in those days, there were no ears to hear it. There was no system to support people that did speak up, and there was certainly no justice for people that actually had the courage to come forward, work with law enforcement, come into a courtroom. We've changed the law tremendously to protect those that come forward. And we still have, and Joni will talk a little bit more about this, but we still have a high percentage of people who never come forward and speak up about their victimization. So we're going to talk tonight about sexual language, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the spectrum. So first thing we look at, and this is what we're talking to young people about, as well as people that are in the community, to understand the difference between what's sexual language, what's sexual harassment, what is sexual assault. Sexual language is when somebody uses terms like, gee, you look so pretty today. And I don't know who thinks that that's offensive, sexual language offensive. You look pretty. Nobody. Well, what if that somebody in school, we'll use school as an example, what if every day this high school senior walks into the classroom and her male teacher says, ooh, you look really pretty today, and says it every single day? Does it change the dynamic? And that's really what we're trying to explain, because the first time we hear, oh, you look pretty today, maybe, oh, I don't really like that. He's my teacher, but whatever, it must be me. That's the common denominator. It must be me. Until it starts happening more and more. And this is the place where we're really trying to empower the person who's the recipient of that language, to say, if it makes you uncomfortable, you do get to say something. You get to say, that's not all right with me. And the place we're really seeing this more than, at least more locally, is in our legislature, where we had almost 200 people who signed the petition saying, this is happening in Sacramento, and it's not acceptable. What we also, this going down the spectrum, we know that sexual harassment is, I hate to say it, and I don't mean it to sound so trite as I will, but it is alive and happening in all of our communities, in our workplaces, in our schools. And we've built a lot of protections around sexual harassment. But for the most part, sexual harassment is what one would think. It's too much focus on someone. It's the way people look at, somebody will look at a woman or the man. It is circumstances where there's actually more that's going on. And what I'm going to refer to is in the workplace or in the school place, that kind of taking language with conduct. So, for instance, having someone say, you look so pretty while they're rubbing their arm or rubbing the back. And you know, this is the thing that got the senator the comedian senator became a senator who's now already, what's his name? Yeah, Al Franken, thank you. I've already got him out of my head. You know, this started with this rubbing on the back that was not okay with the young woman. There's someone who is in Sacramento who's used to a big hugger. So, you know, in the old days, it was a big hugger. But then all of a sudden, people started saying, you know, I don't really like being hugged like that. We're professionals. I don't want you hugging me. And I don't want you hugging me and holding on to the hug for 30 seconds. That's uncomfortable for me. But when that hug then becomes something more, just that alone could be considered harassment. But then we start to see in the harassment environment, the escalation of that kind of behavior. There's some other examples, things like making inappropriate jokes that are attached to groping. There was a case that I recall when I was early in management in the DA's office, and there was a woman who was hired by a law firm, private law firm, and everybody knew, apparently, that one of the partners was a sexual harasser, but nobody put the name to it, and nobody really wanted to discuss it, and nobody wanted to take him on head on. So she got hired, we believe specifically, to be able to get in that guy's space so he could sexually harass her, and then she could sue. And not that she necessarily wanted the money, but to finally bring an end to it, because all the partners in the law firm knew that this guy was harassing all the women. And nobody wanted to do anything about it, and they kind of didn't even believe most of the women. So what his little game was is he would drop M&Ms in the breast pocket of the women, and then he would reach in like he had to get his M&Ms out of their pocket. And of course, he's groping their breasts. And it was all a ruse to do that. And she eventually, she sued him, and the jury came back with a $6 million judgment against him, and then another $6 million against the law firm for not dealing with him, even though they knew that there had been complaints made and they never did anything about it. So our rules in the workplace now are so much stronger around what an employer or a school district's obligations are if somebody comes forward and makes an allegation of sexual harassment. There's a concept that happens that we do see, and that's quid pro quo in the sexual harassment arena, which is essentially if I will give you this if you have sex with me, or I will give you this. This is the whole Harvey Weinstein. You want a job in the movies? Come and give me a massage, which was a euphemism for something else. If you want to have a career, come to my motel room. This is quid pro quo sexual harassment, and also, in his case, there are allegations of sexual assault. The one actress who he literally blackballed because she did complain, and the same thing with Rose McGowan, who filed the lawsuit against him, or not a lawsuit, but filed her complaint with the New York Police Department, that she became blackballed by the movie industry because he was such a powerful force. Unwanted sexual attention, and this is one we're really working with our high school and younger kids around. You know, unfortunately, we've had to prosecute too many teachers and coaches and other people like that for sexual assault and sexual, not so much harassment, and we're going to talk a little bit about the difference on the spectrum. But when kids tell us, I don't like the way my coach is looking at me, our message is empower those children to speak up about that. Because she may not be able to control his behavior, but she can certainly, or he can certainly respond to his own reaction to it. So rather than suppress that feeling that kids are feeling like, this guy's creepy, or I don't want my coach there, or why does he keep touching me, or why is he focusing on me, then we're really empowering them to speak up. And the speak up doesn't mean someone's going to get fired. It doesn't mean they're going to get prosecuted. It doesn't mean that they're going to get sued necessarily. But at least it brings attention to the adult who is giving unwanted sexual attention, what feels like unwanted sexual attention to that child. And then, of course, gender harassment, and we've been dealing with that for quite some time. So going further on the spectrum, we now start to talk about sexual touching. And you know there's a difference between somebody that comes up and gives a hug and somebody who gives the hug. There's a difference between touching my arm versus rubbing my arm in a way that is suggestive. There's the difference between bumping up against someone and purposely rubbing up against someone. In my office, I did training years ago in the old days when people don't do this anymore, but in the old days, people go out and have a drink. My office, kind of the industry standard, at lunchtime. So we put an end to that, of course, but what we realized was that when people drink, their inhibitions lessen and they become scary to people that are in the workplace because they maybe don't realize that they're too close, they're becoming a little bit intimate, their inhibitions are gone. And the fact that their inhibitions are gone is really meaningless. It's the way that the person is perceiving it or the people around are perceiving it. That's where the workplace rules and the school-based rules really come in. For school, Title IX is the important, very important set of body of law that protects children and lays out the procedure for how children are to be, how the response is by the school administrators or the school people. But in the workplace, there are very strong rules about sexual harassment, about all the things we're talking about, this on the spectrum of how is somebody behaving and what can I do about it? And is it me? And really this is the thing that, for me, that if there's one message that we want young people or anyone that's hearing us to hear and take away is that if it feels wrong, it's wrong for them. If it feels wrong, they have the right to speak up and say, I don't like that, don't do that. And if the person continues to do it, now it becomes more actionable because now it becomes harassment. And when there's sexual touching or sexual language or sexual conduct that is attached to that harassment, now it becomes sexual harassment. And then lastly, sexual assault. And that's really where, you know, Joni will talk more about this, but on that spectrum, sexual assault is a crime. So when we look at this, on sexual language, is it a crime? No, not likely, on its face. Is it inappropriate? Absolutely. And it may be give rise to being sexually harassing. For sexual harassment, and this is something we work with our students around the whole county, and we have a Justice Academy also. The mayor's always there with us for our Justice Academy for juniors and seniors in high school from all the high schools. They're with us from January through June, and then they're in a paid internship, and then they come back and give a speech. One of the things that we talk about is cyber sexual harassment or cyberbullying or what happens on the internet. And this is so true for so many young people who are on their phones or on social media or on the internet, that the kind of conduct that goes on there is quite chilling sometimes. And we have too many examples of, taking a picture of someone and posting on the internet. I mean, it's sexual harassment, it's sexual cyber harassment, and it's against the law. So we've really risen to that point where we say that is a crime. And there's a new law. It was Kamala Harris when she was the Attorney General. We worked with her to create this law to say if somebody posts a picture of another person in a sexually explicit or in another harassing way, that is a crime. But when it's sexual harassment in the workplace or in the school base, then we look at civil actions or Title IX actions. So the protections are built in. The question is, who's going to recognize it? And once again, we say to the person who's the recipient of this behavior, is if it feels wrong to you, say something. If it feels wrong to you, you have the right to speak up and tell the person, I don't want you to do that, or go tell someone. In schools particularly, school counselors, the favorite teacher, whomever it is, the principal, whoever it is that person has a relationship with, is someone that they can tell. And maybe it's ignorance, and maybe it's nipping something in the bud, and maybe it's stopping something further from happening. Sorry. Sexual touching can very easily become a crime. It can be harassment, or it can be a crime. We have a crime called sexual battery, which is touching someone with a sexual intent. So an example that we would use is that if somebody is standing at the counter and the person touches them on their rear end, and they're touching them in a way that it's sexual. It may just be a touch, but it's got sexual intent. That can be a sexual battery. It's all, of course, case by case, but we try to just explain how this can happen. A very more common crime is on public transportation, when it's crowded and somebody positions themselves in a way that they're sexually touching a person, and then they can always say, well, it was just so crowded on the public transportation. We pay attention to those people because they're on the spectrum of sex offenders when they are doing that kind of behavior and engaging, putting themselves in a position where they can touch someone sexually. So it can be a crime. Not all, but it can be. And then lastly, sexual assault. And sexual assault, Joni will talk about a little bit more. The punishment, the crime of sexual assault, we still have a small percentage of people that come forward about their own sexual assault. We hope this Me Too, taking the blinders off, is going to open that door up. But we still have a small percentage who report sexual assault, and an even smaller percentage who actually end up in a courtroom for justice. So we've been talking about sexual harassment since the 70s. When I was a rape crisis counselor in the late 70s, that's what we talked about, sexual harassment. We remember Anita Hill in 1991, it changed America, about Anita Hill talking about Clarence Thomas and how he was sexually harassing her by the things that she explained, and how he treated her with some level of discrimination, but also very strong sexual overtones. She's going to be here this week to talk in Oakland, actually. But that's 1991. And now here we are again with this Me Too, where it's like a new thing. Well, no, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been talking for a long time. But what's different about now is that we're talking about powerful people. We're talking about people that have authority and have money and have resources, and like the Harvey Weinsteins and the people that are in politics. You know, we've heard about the politicians, of course, over the years. But now when 200 or 180 women sign a letter in the California legislature to say, this is happening in our legislature, that's a pretty powerful statement for them to make, to sign the letter and move forward. So we all know, and we want to make sure that young people also know that we talk to, this is not new. But this may be the moment because of the Me Too. This may be the moment because it is the Harvey Weinsteins and the people like that that are finally being called out for their behavior. So we talked a little bit about this. These are just different forms of sexual harassment. And with our young people, we're reminding them, this can be the coach, it can be your teacher, it can be a fellow student, it can be the counselor, it can be the neighbor. Nobody is immune. I mean, don't say it that way. There's no one profession that says that is a harasser, and this guy, because he's the teacher, he can't be a harasser. We just really teach people, young people, all the people, to understand and to listen to their own voice in their head. The terminology, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, they sort of mean the same thing. And one of the efforts right now is to try to group the terminology. So now I'm going to turn this over to Joni, but this is just some information about sexual abuse. So if we didn't already know this, we do know that about 1 out of 4 girls are going to be sexually abused or sexually assaulted, and 1 out of 7 boys in their lifetime will be sexually abused or sexually assaulted. So this statistic is startling for many, but it also reminds me that we cannot ignore anybody's complaint, and we cannot ignore when we see things that look out of whack or don't look right. We can't ignore the fact that sexual abuse of children particularly is not uncommon. And many of the children that Joni and I have worked with, and I know law enforcement has worked with, and I'm sure the schools have too, many of those children, for some, didn't even quite realize that what was happening to them was wrong because it was their life, it was their culture and their family. I prosecuted a case once. The man was 87, and he had been molesting everybody in his family for 50 years. My oldest witness that was molested by him was 56, and the case I had was the 6-year-old great-grandson. And everybody in between the 6-year-old and the 56-year-old was molested by this guy. But the family did not appreciate that this was bad, that this was a crime, until the little boy was finally, it happened to the little boy. So I'm going to turn this over to Joni now, and then we'll have some time afterwards to talk more question answer.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being patient with little Phoebe, because she is definitely a work in progress. And so she'll wander because she likes to have lots of attention. So I want to talk to you. There we go. I'm going to talk to you about what I would call the 4 big crimes that we see that are the violent crimes. I'm going to talk a little bit about unlawful sexual intercourse as well. But I want to start with rape, which is the non-consensual sexual intercourse. By definition, under the penal code, that would be between a man and a woman. And it is committed by force, duress, menace, fraud, or the threat of immediate unlawful bodily injury, either to the victim or to somebody else. So, for example, if you don't do this, I'm going to go down the hall and hurt your kids if you don't let me rape you, that kind of threat. The other types of forcible sexual assault and forcible rape you'll see is where someone's unconscious of the nature of the act. You could get that with conscious sedation, like date rape drugs. And then when someone's incapable of consenting. And when we talk about incapable of consenting, that would be an example of someone who's so intoxicated that they cannot freely and voluntarily consent to the act and have an understanding of the nature of the act that they're about to engage in. So those are you'll see that breakdown with all the forcible sex crimes, where you've got those 3. The force one, the one where someone's unconscious and someone's incapable of consent. And by the way, as we move into this and start talking about the other acts, there's no requirement that a victim resist what's happening. It has to do with consent, not that you have to put up a fight if something happens and you're in the situation. Before I move to the 3 other violent ones, I do want to talk about unlawful sexual intercourse, and that's where it occurs between an adult and a minor. That is going to be a non-forcible offense, and not consensual, because children can't consent. So for everybody out there, until you're 18, you're not capable of giving consent for this type of an act. So it's always going to be non-consensual, but also non-forcible in that particular instance. So you are aware, this says sexual intercourse. You're also going to see similar statutes for sodomy, oral copulation, and penetration by a foreign object, where it could be an adult and a minor, non-forcible. Before I move to the next one, really quickly, let me say to you, when you start committing acts on children that are under the age of 14, it's a whole different area. There are different punishments, and we'd be here for a really long time if we covered that, but there are specific crimes that deal with child sexual assault when they're under the age of 14. Oral copulation is where someone puts their mouth on the sex organ of another person, and again, with the violent crimes and the forcible crimes, this could be by force, duress, menace, fraud, or threat of immediate bodily injury to the victim or to someone else. Also, that could happen with someone who's unconscious of the nature of the act. Date rape drugs, again, perfect example. You can be completely out with some of the drugs like GHB, but you'll also comply with the orders that somebody gives you. And so you could have someone having no idea they're orally copulating someone because they've been given a drug and they're complying with those orders. I tell people all the time, if a lot of people go, wait, if you get a colonoscopy, they're going to give you a drug that is actually the same kind of class of drug as a date rape drug. And you know what they do when they go in for that procedure, and you have no idea that's taking place. But you will comply with the doctor when they have you turn to do certain things so they can complete the procedure. It's the same kind of drug. You also have sodomy, which is the penetration of the anus of one person without the consent of the other. Again, this is going to be force, threats, duress, menace, all those things we've been talking about, or someone who's unconscious of the nature of the act, or someone who's incapable of consenting because they're too intoxicated. And finally, sexual penetration. The distinction with sexual penetration is that can be with anything but a sex organ. So it could, we oftentimes will see it with fingers, but we will see objects too that people will use to penetrate either the genitalia or the anus of someone, and that's the sexual penetration. Again, the same classification, force, duress, menace, that area, or having somebody who is incapable of consenting or unconscious of what's going on. I think one of the biggest questions we get when we go out and talk in the public is the issue of consent. Because it's clearly an agreement between the parties to engage in sexual activity, and there are a lot of ways that you can give consent. What happened, though, is that things changed a bit, because what does consent look like? It is not the same definition in the criminal justice system as it is in the school system or the academic system. So when Governor Brown signed the affirmative consent law that deals with our academic system, they talk about an affirmative, voluntary, conscious agreement to engage in sex. And I hope I won't offend anybody, but when I talk to kids or college students, I say to them, it's very specific to the point where I think you need to have a contract and say, is it okay if I kiss you? Would you initial here? How about if I use my tongue? Okay, initial here, because I've got to have a yes to that. What if I want to touch you here? Now I need to have yet another affirmative consent to the act as you're moving your way through. They wanted no gray area with the campus sexual assault and school sexual assault of what consent means. In the criminal justice system, it's freely and voluntarily engaging in the sex act and understanding the nature of the act. You don't have to affirmatively say yes to what's going on, because we use circumstantial evidence all the time to look at consent. So we may see an instance where a woman doesn't say anything as a man is trying to get inside of her, but if she's holding her legs together, holding her body, turning, trying to get away, that's pretty good circumstantial evidence that she didn't consent. If you have the opposite and there's none of that and you don't have any force or anything that would have overcome the victim, then you may have a situation where it does look to be consensual in the criminal justice system. Do you guys have any questions before? Because we're going to give you some information on this just in terms of sexual assault and those differences. No? It's too much to talk about this subject matter. I do want to say because we've got a few minutes and we are going to open it up to questions. I have been in the office almost 24 years. I've tried a fair amount of homicides in my career and sexual assault cases. I have to tell you, I think they're by far some of the most important cases that we try because of the impact that it has on the people who survive those particular crimes. And I know I'm using the term victim because as a DA, you tend to use that term when you're in front of a jury. But I think it's so important that we encourage people to come forward and to talk about it and be open about it and not be afraid of it. When Nancy talked about the fact that we oftentimes don't have people come forward, you know that sexual assault is the most underreported crime in the United States. And when you start talking about a victim that actually knows the person, which is more often the case, it's usually an acquaintance rape, not the stranger on the street, the reporting drops even lower than it already is. And for our male victims, they make up about 10% of the victims that we obviously know about, and again, they are much less likely to come forward and report. So I think it's really important for people to encourage people to come forward and understand that we will do everything we can to help them get through the system and help them get through it gently and also try to seek justice for them. We put up the numbers on who to tell, so we've talked about Bay Area Women Against Rape, and we've got the hotline number and their direct office line for people to call. They're amazing. They're advocates that are so incredible and so helpful in guiding people through when they have been the victim of sexual assault. If you're at a school, I would encourage people, if something happens, to tell a teacher or a counselor or a principal, somebody that can, and they will help you get through it and report if something inappropriate's happened. And obviously, you want to call the police agency. We've got the Albany Police Department direct line there, but if it was an emergency, we all know to call 911 if something comes up. Do you guys have any questions for us? You got it. When you got Ms. O'Malley here, you got to take advantage, guys. She's been doing this a long time, and she knows way more than I do about this stuff. So you've got to, if you get a chance to ask questions, anything. And I have to tell Nancy, because she didn't hear you say this, but that's Phoebe who has a question over there.
I was just wondering, like, is there a spectrum when you're intoxicated of being able to give consent, or is it just like once you're intoxicated, any consent is invalid?
Such a great question. And actually, I'll tell you, I was teaching at a hospital to nurses, and I said something about the level of intoxication is going to depend, right? Because some people can have a 0.24 blood alcohol, and if I drink every day, I might know exactly what I'm doing. Because I drink every day, I metabolize it differently.
Yeah.
So you've got to really look at those circumstances to determine if they were incapable of consenting. One of the nurses said, "No, you're wrong about that, Ms. Leventis. If it's a 0.08 or above, then they're incapable of consenting." I was like, no, that would be a DUI. So you might have somebody who's had one drink, and if they've never had a drink, they really have no idea what they're doing. And you could have other circumstances where they may have had a fair amount, but still be capable of giving legal consent within the criminal justice system.
So one of the things that Joni and I both have worked on the campus protocol, the protocols for especially the UC campuses on what the protocol is, because what we know is across America and also here at our own UC Berkeley, that women were coming forward to talk about their sexual assault and they weren't getting the response from the school administrations. Part of that, the response to that, was the change of the law for consent in the academic environment to make it very clear. But the issue around alcohol is really a critical issue that the schools all talk to students when they're coming in. They go through an orientation. At our Justice Academy, it was actually a young man from Albany High who, the way it works is every other week people come in and talk about aspects of justice. Someone talked about that very thing, sexual assault on campus, and how are the schools responding, and do they believe the victim? And in some of those settings, they would be an administrative hearing where the victim would be sitting there by herself, generally female, but not always, and the person who is accused is sitting right next to her, and they're having this out in this hearing room. So we changed the law to make sure there were victim advocates present to give support and things like that. But basically, what this young man came up with was not only should students go through their orientation about sexual assault and things like that, but there should be a big discussion about alcohol. Like, how much alcohol does it take for someone to get so intoxicated they don't know what's going on? And the challenge with that from an evidence standpoint is many people they look drunk and they may be completely unconscious, not conscious to their surroundings, but still engaging. And so a lot of this is really the work that police do. And there are a lot of things in areas in the law that allow us to bring in other evidence, like it's natural to tell someone once the victim realizes that something happened, and that person can then become a first complaint witness to things like that. So we do a lot around that. But this young man decided, or his advocacy was, they should be adding alcohol. And what does alcohol do? And what about date rape drugs? And so we also tell young people coming into their college settings is that if they ever go to a party, of course many of them do, if they go to a party, never drink anything out of an open glass. Take it in a bottle and keep your hand on top of the bottle. And we're just trying to give tips to make sure that this subtle stuff doesn't happen to them. There was a study many years back, but it was focusing on, again, campus rape. So I keep going back to this. This isn't new. But this was a survey they did at UC Davis. And they went to the fraternities. And they asked them, one of the pivotal questions was, if you thought you could get away with forcing a girl to have sex, would you? And 80% said yes. Just such a lack of awareness. And again, we just cannot let these moments continue to pass us by, where we can have the opportunity to really change these paradigms about how people view this behavior. Yeah.
So what happens after this report?
You know, so, okay, you have these phone numbers, something happens, somebody reports it. I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't report is because they don't know, like, well, so what's that going to do? Or then I'm on the hot seat, you know, then I have to, like you said, she's sitting next to, you know, the person that was accused. So it's a very uncomfortable thing to have to relive, and then if it's somebody you know what's going to happen to them. So can you give some examples of, like, what happens?
Such a great question. So first of all, we have built into the law that if a person has been sexually assaulted or is making that statement, that they have the right to have an advocate present. The advocate serves, they're all trained, they have to be certified. The communication between the victim advocate, the rape crisis advocate, and the person is confidential, so they can speak openly. There's some little way that can be breached, but generally not. But the advocates are a buffer for that. They can speak for the survivor when she, and I'm just going to say she, but we know there are men who are also being assaulted, they can be the buffer, they can speak for the survivor, they can say, you know what, we're done talking, we're now going to take a break, or whatever. So it's a very protective but supportive way, as much as the survivor needs. That's the first thing, having a survivor present to really be there to be the companion or be the support. The second thing is, there's so many different, law enforcement is trained so well for forensic interviewing. So it's not, okay, just the facts, ma'am, but, how are you doing? Really coming at it from a humane way. We've worked very hard to create the laws and to do training with law enforcement and with the hospital staff. Our sexual assault response team, which is primarily located at Highland Hospital, is so amazing. They have trained forensic examiners. If somebody presents or comes in as a sexual assault, that person is pulled off of their regular assignment so that everything that happens, there's room for the officers to be there to be writing their report. There are advocates there. There's a trained forensic examiner who's talking through it. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is comforting. Some people don't want to know that much, but everything is done to try to support the survivor. And the other part of California law is no sexual assault survivor can be compelled to give a statement. They can't be compelled to talk to the police. They can't be compelled to, even if they do, in the case there's evidence of the crime, they cannot be compelled to come to court and testify about it. So those nuances that you talked about, what if it's somebody that you know? What if, there's a whole bunch of what ifs, and how am I going to deal with that? What if my family thinks that I'm the one who is breaking up the family, things like that. We do a lot with counseling to help people be able to address some of these issues and to process it for themselves. And I have to say, we are very good. We have learned a lot from the history of working with sexual assault survivors on how we as supportive systems can deal with that. But giving choice back to the survivor is very empowering. And it's a healing process. No matter what the ultimate decision is, it's a healing process. And I know Joni and I have both, I've dealt with thousands of survivors, rape victims, survivors. And I've tried many cases, as has Joni. And I've dealt with a lot of people who chose not to. And it's the same level of support that we give. The last thing is that for a lot of people, they maybe don't have the means. Maybe they don't have insurance to pay for counseling or their medical things like that. We pay for that. Even if they don't want to talk to the police, or they don't want to be involved with the criminal justice. That allows people to get the counseling that will help. And again, it's a healing process. So.
And one thing I would add when she talks about running the sexual assault unit, that consists of a group of lawyers that do vertical prosecution. So you've got, with these really horrific crimes, you have one DA, assuming that somehow they don't get transferred to another assignment, because you can't, they do those assignments for about 3 years, but you would have one DA that would do the preliminary hearing and continue to do the trial with the victim. So you don't have a victim that comes in and she talks to me today, and then, you know, she talks to Nancy who's trying the case, or maybe something happens and she ends up dealing with 5 different DAs. You get a team of our inspector, who's the police officer within the DA's office, our victim witness advocate that is assigned and with that victim throughout, and then a DA who's doing the case. And I know Nancy does a really good job of picking people on those units because she assigns people. So you're not going to have the people who are uncomfortable with the subject matter and don't do well with that particular kind of victim. You're going to get people that really are committed to helping the victims get through it, and get through it gently and help them get justice without torturing them through the process and hurting them more. And that's a really amazing thing to see how much healing it does for them and how empowering it is. I've had so many people who get up on the stand, they're scared to death, and they come out. And one example, a little girl that was 13 who didn't want to do it, we worked with her counseling. She got on and testified against her stepdad, and when I walked out after the preliminary hearing, she went like this, "Superwoman," to me, and she was so empowered by standing up to him. So it can be really healing too.
This is one area where we actually have paid attention to the data and to outcomes so that we've refined it. You know, we've got longitudinal studies that are 20, 30 years. How is someone doing after treatment? How's therapy? You know, how is someone doing? How are they interacting with their children? How do they interact with their spouse or their partner? And follow so that we can really be educated, understanding the dynamic, so that we can refine the way in which we provide support and intervention. The challenge for people, I'll say just very quickly, is that society understands sexual assault. It's still a barrier. There's a barrier. The place where we're really pushing is understanding sexual harassment, because sexual harassment can be very intimidating, especially if what's attached to the harassment is, if I don't do this, I'll lose my job or my reputation or whatever. It's very complicated. We still have a lot of work to do to teach and educate and sensitize people to what that is.
Well, that's pretty close to what my question was, is what kind of education goes on, especially for, and I'm going to say for young men because that's primarily, that educates them that no means no, and that just touching on somebody's arm or somebody's shoulder, if they say no, they mean back off. What kind of education is going to, they don't think it's a joke, they don't think, well, the next time I'll push it a little harder and go down the wrong path.
Well, this is a really, first there's a lot of, well, there are laws that say in the education code that you have to, the schools have to present in health ed, sexual training, not training, but sexual education, sex education. We now have changed a law to add human trafficking for 5th graders and above. So there's a lot of health ed classes, but they're 2 hours. So it's not significant. You know, part of what, there's a part of kids being goofy when their, you know, hormones are flowing and they're starting and they're goofy and they're, you know, snapping bras and doing stupid stuff like that. That's the place where it's important to start having the conversation if it hasn't occurred before. Because it may look like a joke, and maybe it is meant as a joke, but that's the place where people where the ability to stop that confusion and to give information about behaviors and treatment and respect and boundaries and all of those things is what we do in school. Years ago, there were programs, not years ago, there have been programs, child assault prevention, where the volunteers mostly would go into schools and talk about good touching and bad touching and boundaries and inappropriate space violations and all of the things that we know are could be precursor to then harassment or even sexual assault. And you know, I would say that for boys, that we really rely on men to speak up to. So we can talk about it, but it's really a way for men to be able to help young men learn to be adult men who are respectful and appropriate with the people with whom, the women, or the people with whom they're dealing. So that's part of it. Part of it is, you know, we're combating the internet. We're combating pornography. Frankly, I mean, the issue around pornography And young people, younger and younger, are looking at pornography in some amazing, horrible numbers. And we know because we track things like that, and we're really studying the influence that pornography has, especially on young minds, of what's appropriate, what's acceptable, what is, what they can do. And this is really a serious issue. It's one of the focuses that we're giving now. It's overwhelming. We actually have a website in our human trafficking work. And our website is, if somebody goes trolling on the internet looking for a minor to purchase for sex, that they may hit on our website. And what comes up when they hit on our website, it says, you've reached the Alameda County District Attorney's Office and we have your IP address. Some people go to the next slide, they push for next, like, what are you looking for? But we actually have a group of men who volunteer, and they call those people, and we'll talk to them and try to build empathy and understanding and things like that. And we've interviewed men in some of our work who have been purchasers, who are looking for children, child rapists, and interview them in controlled settings, of course. The influence of pornography is really disturbing and very prevalent. And so for me, what we work with our men companions to say, we need to really address this with young boys. And we know in the high schools, we're hearing more and more from high schools about they're passing the videos around, and they're even more than just pornography. They're aggressive pornography, and this is our next big challenge as far as I'm concerned. How we don't normalize that kind of treatment.
So is it the case you're finding a difference since laws are changing about the workplace and sexual harassment, and not just in, let's say, in the corporate world, but across the board?
Well, in California, any business that has more than 50 employees has to do sexual harassment training every 2 years. We've been doing it for a long time because it's an issue of mine. So when I got into a position of authority, even before becoming the DA, that was one of our mandatory trainings. But the law is very specific now, and here's really if people can't figure it out, I mean, you can give the information, you can talk to them about, nip it in the bud, if there's something, have a counseling session, all that. But the bottom line is that if somebody sexually harasses in the workplace, not only is the employer liable, but so is the individual. And if it's a supervisor, they're even more liable. So those $6 million judgments are against an individual who committed the crime, or not the crime, but the behavior. And the employer who's either hasn't given the training or hasn't addressed it responsibly, then that employer can be also civilly liable. So if we can't figure out how to get people just to do it because it's the right thing, then hitting people in their pocketbook is a big motivator to stop certain behaviors. And it's still stunning about what people do. There was one case that we're aware of where it was actually a city manager, not from any place in Northern California, but in Southern California, who was sending pornography and these suggestive emails to subordinate women in his office. And of course, they were like, who am I supposed to tell? He's my boss. So the whole structure of how that gets reported is pretty prescribed in the law now. And again, I think money is a big motivator, the fear of being fired and then also having a big judgment against them.
Can I add to that, also extending that to customers as well?
That's a very good question. So the question is extending it to customers. It doesn't have to be an employee who's being the harasser. It can be, somebody who's coming in doing business with them. The laws, again, is the same thing, that if the report is made of sexual harassment or sexually inappropriate contact, then this process for the employer is the same. And if either the employer doesn't act on it, the employer can be liable. And the person who is the actor, the one who's doing it, can also be sued for sexual harassment. We have to end with like something light and fun.
It is a pretty heavy topic.
Yes.
What age you start talking to kids about this? Because you'd said, you know, I'm thinking preschool, just touching, you know, the setting boundaries, communicating. That doesn't feel good, you know, it's not sexual usually at that age, but, you know, kids are pushing and touching each other and learning boundaries.
So we advise talking to kids as young as when they first start 2, 3 years old about this is your body. Only mommy gets to, or daddy gets to touch you in certain places. And, you know, I think there's a fine line between asking children about behaviors without overemphasizing it and freaking the child out. But once kids start to, the whole issue around body and boundaries and body sensitivity and touching is really an early conversation. For human trafficking, which is for children, is really just child rape by people who are paying money to do it, or someone who's getting money to have the child rape, the minor rape. That the law says 5th grade. We start talking to kids younger, but not about human trafficking. We talk about, again, like your body is your space. You have the right to say, stay away from me. This is the distance. We used to do a thing with, we've done a lot with victims of sexual assault who have cognitive disabilities, who don't recognize boundaries. And we work with the police, and you know, the police, when they're in full gear, they've got big belts and they've got a gun and all sorts of things on their belt. And what we found was that for certain people that didn't have the cognitive ability to understand this boundary thing, but understood something bad happened to them, I saw one young woman run to the police officer who was so freaked out because she was just wanting to hug him, and he was trying to make sure she didn't, like, oh, don't, let me take him. And at the same time trying to be loving and generous. So part of it is just really talking about that. And talking it in normal ways rather than when there's a crisis or there's this threat or there's something going on. With the child assault prevention, we talk to kids in the 1st grade about these same things. That your body is for you. Talk to you, make sure you have someone to tell if something feels bad. And also what I started with is never to discount someone's own sense of how they feel, how something is, they're responding to it. Because we tend in this society, in our society, to discount our intuition. There's a wonderful book that was written a long time ago called The Gift of Fear, and it really compares animal kingdom to us in our society. In the animal kingdom, if an animal feels threatened, or the hair on the back of their neck or whatever, they don't ignore it. They do something about it. They leave or they fight. For us, you know, we're taught to be nice about it. So if the hair on the back of my neck stands up because some guy's standing too close and I'm nearly uncomfortable, I'm thinking I don't want to be rude. Really, it's okay to be rude to someone who's making you uncomfortable if rude is what you need. And that's really what we talk to kids about too. Listen to their own voice, and if it doesn't feel right, say something. And when we receive that information, validate it. It doesn't mean something bad happened, but we can validate it and then talk about what happened. I think that's really, for what we see in our line of work, and I'm sure the officers do too, that it's when kids don't feel like they can speak up is when that they suppress and repress and then become more vulnerable to somebody taking advantage of them.
And on a light note, because this will be a little bit light, so one of the women that I supervise has a little boy, and they had the talk with him. He is, at the time, he was about 5 years old, and they had the talk with him about mommy and daddy can touch you in your private parts because we wash you or we might help you after you go potty, and we're going to do that, but nobody else should be touching you. Well, she took him into the doctor, and the nurse came in and started talking about doing an exam, and he turned and was like, mommy and daddy can touch me, but only when they're washing me and when I go potty. But you're not supposed to be touching me because I don't know who you are, and that's not okay. So you can talk to them in a way where they get it and understand that there's certain types of touching, even from parents, that are okay and other stuff that isn't.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much to both of you for coming out tonight, and for all of you that were here, thank you very much. I think we've all learned a lot, and Thank you for bringing Phoebe.
You're welcome. She's pretty excited.
I think we can get Phoebe up past her bedtime.
I'm gonna reach out and see if she's gonna pull.
All right, well, thank you very much.